In making a video on Joshua Tree, I don't know really where to start. It's one of the most beautiful areas in the country. It has different moods depending on the time of year that you go to Joshua Tree. If you go in the springtime, you might see beautiful wildflowers. In the winter, there's a chance of snow decorating the rocks. In June, you can have the monsoon. Actually, it isn't limited to June, but you can have thunderstorms that bring water, flash floods. It's an area of just diverse beauty. I'm primarily a photographer, so my time on this last trip was early in the morning, late in the evening, spending time in the hotel during the middle of the day. On these videos, I always want to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of history, a little bit about the culture, the peoples, but that's really hard to balance with trying to show how beautiful a place is. I did make a number of hikes. I want to mention that when you go to a national park, it's really a good idea to go to the visitor center. There are actually 3 visitor centers. There's one at Yucca Valley. There's one over in 29 Palms. There's one down in the Cottonwood area. And they all have their benefits. The one at Yucca Valley can be very, very busy. That's one of the most beautiful ways to enter the park. The park is gorgeous. Again, it can be very, very hot. There's no water available in the park, so please plan accordingly. Again, the best photography is early in the morning and late in the afternoon, early evening, the golden hours. And it is a beautiful, beautiful location, and I highly recommend that you make the time to visit Joshua Tree. Please, again, take the pamphlets that you have from the visitor centers. The rangers were very kind to me. They circled on their map the best places to go as a photographer. I had been to the southern end of the park, the Cottonwood Springs area, but at this time, I really wanted to focus on the most photogenic parts of the park, and I came in through Yucca Valley. On previous trips, I'd been to the Cottonwood Springs area, and I'd been over to the 29 Palms entry area, and that's the way you access 49 Palms Oasis. Park is gorgeous. I can't emphasize enough that it's a must-do as a photographer. The big challenge is it's very, very busy. In the winter months, if you can go during the week, I had very, very, very little traffic and visitors because I was there in mid-June and it was very hot. Everywhere you go in Joshua Tree, or almost everywhere you go, there's imprints left by a very interesting individual, Bill Keys. Bill Keys' real name was George Barth. He was born in Russia. His parents immigrated as Germans from Russia to Nebraska. And his father was a very talented gentleman. And that's probably where Bill Keys learned all his skill sets that he had, engineering and just being able to do farming and just a multitude of things that he did throughout his life. That wasn't uncommon for some of those early immigrants. Bill Keys only had a 5th grade education, but he accomplished some amazing engineering feats and ranching and farming feats. So a little bit about Bill Keys as I hike out to the Barker Dam. Barker built the dam in 1907. Later, Bill Keys expanded it to try to claim it. And like a lot of things in Joshua Tree and in the West, things were not easy. In fact, the whole story that I left off in last time was about the cattlemen coming. But I didn't talk about Bill McCaney and his gang. And they were famous cattle rustlers that were known for what they did as far as rustling cattle. And they were known for going and stealing cattle out of the lands around Phoenix and then bringing them and hiding them in the Joshua Tree area. And in those days, Joshua Tree had about 11 inches of rainfall a year compared to the 4 inches that it gets now. So there was a lot more grass and grassland available. Now, they did not hide the cattle in Hidden Valley. They actually were around the area that's known as cow pasture. But what they were famous for was stealing and rustling cattle, and then they would rebrand it, and the brand that they used was quite a bit larger, so it could be used to cover up other ranchers' brands. And then they took the cattle after the rebranding to LA. And when from Los Angeles, they came back and they would steal not only cattle but horses, and then they would rebrand those and take them to the Phoenix market. And so they were notorious for doing this for a number of years. The end of this came when the Riverside County was formed, and that meant that there was more law enforcement and more complaints to law enforcement about the rustling. Bill Keyes was not part of that. Bill Keyes actually had a mining background, and he came down to be the superintendent of the Desert Queen mine, and that operation failed. And so for back wages, he was given the land and the mine. And so that became the basis of the Desert Queen Ranch. The Desert Queen Ranch was known for its productivity. Without Francis, Bill's life would not have been as complete. A little story about the courting of Francis. Bill met her in Big Bear, California, and wanted her to bring her to the desert area around Joshua Tree, and so she could see, how rough and, how forlorn the area was, kind of desolate in other words. But the bottom line was she married him anyway, and their marriage lasted 56 years. Now back to George Barth as a young man. The story from his autobiography tells the story that he had left home at 15, and his dad had made him shoot his own horse, which he didn't want to. The horse was brought back hot, but with a limp. Just did not sit well with young George. George enlisted in the military, and in waiting to go to Cuba for the Spanish-American War, he contracted the typhoid fever. A lot of people did because of the poor sanitation and overcrowding in the enlistment areas. Later, that would claim Bill's life at the age of 89. But he had a very interesting life, and some of these stories from Joshua Tree would be great content for Louis L'Amour. And anyway, there's a gentleman that moved close to Bill Keyes, and this gentleman had been law enforcement in the LA area, but he was angered and very nasty towards Bill Keyes for no reason at all. And he was already showing signs of great aggression, and that may have been why he was removed from law enforcement in the LA area. That gentleman started to become extremely aggressive toward Bill Keyes. And on the incident that is pretty famous, Bill Keyes was driving on the road, which we'll call an easement that he'd used for 30 years. And when he was driving on the road, he came across a barricade with a sign that says, "This is your last warning, Keyes. Stay off my land." And Keyes was, a prospector that had very acute senses and was very aware of his surroundings. Keyes grabbed his Remington Model 30 rifle. He proceeded up to a ridgeline where he'd have a good vantage point, and that's where his neighbor started shooting at him. So Bill Keyes, in self-defense, shot his neighbor Bagley dead. This later would lead to a very unfair trial against Bill Keyes, with all the evidence being cooked by the deputy sheriff. And I didn't really understand the full reasons until I studied the book Ambush that tells the story. And so even though the neighbor shot first, none of that evidence was presented, and the fact that there were multiple shell casings found showing that the neighbor had shot several times was one of the biggest pieces of evidence suppression. And we'll get back to the deputy sheriff involved in just a little bit. This shooting occurred in 1943. William Keyes was convicted of manslaughter and sent to San Quentin prison. While at San Quentin prison, Frances was not happy with her husband being falsely convicted, and she started doing everything in her power to help him. And she wrote many letters looking for a chance to get an appeal or some help. Eventually what happened was there was a gentleman his name's Stanley Gardner, or actually Earl Stanley Gardner, that is very famous for those of you that are a little bit older that grew up with Perry Mason. He was the writer behind the Perry Mason stories. But at the time, there was a very popular magazine called Argosy, and in there they had features called The Court of Last Resort. And that's where Earl Stanley Gardner would present a case for somebody that had been convicted wrongly. And when that person was convicted wrongly, they would try to have evidence looked at to get an appeal, or in some cases a pardon, or have the case looked at again. And so Earl Stanley Gardner set his team working on trying to bring the attention to help the person involved. And that person eventually was Bill Keyes, and Bill was paroled after the lengthy prison stay. I believe his whole time was 12 years in San Quentin. One of the first things that became obvious when the evidence was reviewed against Bill Keyes was the fact that Bill Keyes had the deputy sheriff cooking the evidence against him. And the reason was Bill Keyes, because of the war, had grazing rights that deputy sheriff wanted for himself and actually got as soon as Bill Keyes was incarcerated. That deputy sheriff went on to become the main sheriff. And so that was a huge conflict of interest and a red flag to anybody that looked at the evidence that was withheld and not presented. So that was strike one against Bill Keyes with his first trial. And so from there, things happened pretty quickly. Eventually, Bill Keyes was able to get a full pardon, and, he was reunited with his wife. And can you imagine 12 years of your life in San Quentin prison for some crime that you really didn't commit? It was committed in self-defense. There is a plaque or a monument on a portion of Joshua Tree where Bill Keyes commemorated that shooting. The National Park Service has a portrayal of Bill Keyes in that shootout, a photograph, but it's obviously incorrect because in that situation, looks like Bill Keyes is holding a single action Army Colt pistol. In reality, used a Model 30 rifle and a bolt action rifle that is a descendant of the 1917 Enfield pattern rifles. And then as soon as Bill Keyes was pardoned and was able to legally own firearms again, he ended up again being pictured with a Model 30 Enfield type rifle. So I love the National Park Service, but there was a little cooking of that scene for drama, I'm afraid. But anyway, something that I had mentioned about Hidden Valley is Hidden Valley had not been used by the Bill McCaney brothers for their cattle rustling operation. There is evidence that it was used to hide cattle in the past by other operators. Bill Keyes is not one of them. Something that I included in my past there is the fact that Bill Keyes had a mill that he operated. He found it was much more profitable to process the ore for other miners than it was to mine himself. The gold vein in the Desert Queen mine had long panned out, so he found it better. It was an amazing mill, and it operated all the way up to 1969. So just a remnant of the old days. I mentioned earlier about Joshua Tree becoming a national monument in 1936, and this had been kind of a thorn in Bill Keyes and his family's flesh, because they had depended on the lands for grazing around there, and that greatly restricted their grazing. Bill and his wife were always quick to adapt, and even after being in San Quentin, Bill didn't hold a grudge. He was able to get on with his life. And so Bill and Frances actually built a store there on their property. It had originally been known as the Delta Queen Ranch. Later it was changed to the Keyes Ranch. And you can take a tour of that with a reservation with the rangers. You're not allowed in there because they're trying to protect the artifacts. Also, if you do go to the actual mill location, it's like some of my experience with Rhyolite. That's all fenced off now. But I did manage to snag a photo or two of it. It's anyway, to make a long story a little bit shorter, Bill Keyes is an amazing character, and his imprint is found in just so many places in Joshua Tree. The ranger's recommendation to visit Keyes View in the evening was a great suggestion. You have a beautiful view out to the Salton Sea, the Banning Pass, overlooking Palm Springs, and on the beautiful evenings that I had, it was well worth the trip. Now, I did not do the whole hike because it was still really hot. It was probably in the low 100s when I was up on the mountaintop. That used to be called the Salton View because of its view of the Salton Sea. But again, everything has been impacted by Bill Keyes. Pretty amazing man. There's a whole bunch of history that's available about his life. The book Ambushed. I'll put in the name of the author. I don't remember right now.